The Korean nation is an ancient one, and it is certainly no stranger to war. The conflict we're seeing here in 1950 is just the latest in a long battle for control of this peninsula. So to understand this war, we'll have to go back into the pages of history. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a Korean War in real-time special episode. Okay, I've got over 500 years of history to cover here, so let's get busy. Let's go back to about 1400. Korea, or Joseon, was a kingdom under the Yi dynasty and a tributary state of the Chinese Empire. Many other countries in South and East Asia were also tributary states. Vietnam, Cambodia, Borneo, Ceylon, just to name a few. But Korea was pretty much the top ranked among them and had a privileged relationship with the Chinese. From there, Korea enjoyed about 400 years of relative peace, broken by two unsuccessful Japanese invasions in 1592 and 1597, and a couple of punitive invasions by the Manchus in 1627 and 1636. The Manchus did not want to dominate Korea. This was more of a warning that they were the new bosses in town. Shortly afterwards, they overthrew the Ming dynasty in China and established their own Qing dynasty. For Korea, things carried on pretty much as they had already been. But things began to change in the late 1800s as China came under increasing external pressure from the European powers, the United States and Japan. These foreign powers also challenged China's domination of Korea, with the Japanese being the first to force the Koreans into signing a treaty in 1876. In response, the Koreans signed treaties with basically every other foreign power they could find. Seriously, they signed treaties with the USA, Britain, Germany, Italy, Russia, France, Austria, Belgium, and Denmark. Still, by the 1890s, the peninsula became a three-way fight between the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Russians. Eventually, it was the Japanese who emerged victorious. They defeated the Chinese in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, some of which was fought on Korean soil, and defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. The decisive Battle of Tsushima was fought in the Korea Strait. Through all this, the British supported the Japanese as a counterweight to the Russians and to secure Japanese recognition of British rule in India. After the war, Korea became a protectorate of Japan. Then in 1910, the Japanese annexed the country fully as a colony. The imperial dynasty that had more or less ruled Korea for almost half a millennium came to an end as Emperor Seongjong was forced to sign away his country. In his place, the Japanese installed a governor general, and Japanese officials took over the senior levels of government, the judiciary, law enforcement, and education. They responded with extraordinary brutality when Korean activists read a Declaration of Independence in Seoul in February 1919. Known as the March 1st incident, this was followed by nationwide protests against imperial rule. In response, the Japanese arrested 50,000 and killed an estimated 7,500 people. After this, though, Japanese rule underwent a period of relative liberalization in the early 1920s. The government allowed greater expression of Korean culture, literature, language, and the arts, as well as criticism of some elements of imperial rule, although not imperialism itself, of course. But the moderation quickly gave way to a new harshness in the late 20s and the 30s as the Japanese sought to transform Korea and the Korean people from colonized foreigners to an integral part of Japan itself. Not only did the authorities wipe out overt opposition from nationalists, socialists, communists, and labor movements, but they also stamped out even the restrained expressions of Korean nationhood that had been allowed in the early 1920s. Measures included stricter enforcement of compulsory worship before imperial shrines, the exclusive use of the Japanese language in schools, the forced adoption of Japanese names in 1939, the banning of Korean attire, and wide-ranging restrictions on the use of the Korean language and script, including forced closure, after numerous suspensions, of the leading dailies Chosan Ilbo and Donghae Ilbo in 1940. By the time of the Pacific War, 1941-45, there was every reason to believe that the Japanese would succeed in extinguishing Korea as a separate, identifiable culture, and that any future reconstruction of a Korean state would be rendered impossible. During the Second War, over 5 million Koreans worked for the Japanese war effort in one way or another. There was also a mass movement out of the peninsula. About 2.4 million Koreans ended the war in Japan, and another 2.2 million in Manchuria. Some 200,000 Koreans served in the Imperial Japanese Army. This Korean involvement in the Japanese war effort spanned the whole spectrum from voluntary to coerced. At one end, you had forced laborers who worked and died in miserable conditions, and the comfort women forced into sex slavery. In the middle, there were the conscript laborers and soldiers, and Koreans forced to leave home through poverty. Then, at the other end, you had the volunteer soldiers and officers who passed a very competitive selection process for service in the IJA, and the Korean businessmen and landowners who profited handsomely from the war. The issue of collaboration with the Japanese comes up time and time again before and during the Korean War. So, let's talk about two of the men who will lead their nations to war in 1950. As I said, the Japanese had pretty much killed off any overt communist and socialist resistance in the late 1920s. The Korean Communist Party fled to China, where they aligned themselves with the Chinese Communist Party and fought a guerrilla war against the Japanese in Manchuria. They became known as the Yan'an Group. But some of the Korean communists followed a different path, pledging allegiance to Joseph Stalin rather than Mao Zedong. Among their number was Kim Song-ju, who joined as an 18-year-old in 1930. Kim took the nom de guerre Kim Il-sung and fought for 10 years in eastern Manchuria. The Japanese eventually pushed Kim's group out of Manchuria, and the future leader of North Korea retreated across the border into the Soviet Union with a dozen or so men in 1940. There, he joined the Red Army's 88th Separate Rifle Brigade, manned by Koreans and Chinese, and rose to the rank of major. Also in China was the Korean Provisional Government, the KPG, which was based first in Shanghai and then in Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist capital of Chongqing. The KPG was a pretty diverse group, drawn from both left and right, but united in support for independence. They achieved little of real note in the 20s and 30s, but one KPG figure will be very significant. That is Syngman Rhee, Korean conservative resistor against the Japanese, first leader of the KPG and future president of South Korea. He didn't stick around with the KPG long. In 1925, he returned to the U.S., where he had already spent time, having changed his name from Yi Sung-man to the more Americanized Syngman Rhee. He studied at Harvard and Princeton and became the leading campaigner in the West for Korean independence. He established himself as a charismatic personality, a skilled political operator, and a gifted public speaker. I will speak plenty more of him in the next such history special. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead a bit to the end of the Second World War now. If you think I've glossed over that whole Titanic conflict, then you're in luck. There are 6 years worth of videos over on our World War II channel for you to catch up on. Throughout the whole conflict, the Allied powers did not really give much thought to what would happen to Korea after the defeat of the Japanese Empire. At the Cairo Conference in 1943, Britain, the US, and nationalist China did agree that Korea would become free and independent, but when that would happen was never specified beyond in due course. They subsequently affirmed this arrangement together with the Soviet Union in the Potsdam Declaration of July 1945, and the Soviets had already agreed to enter the war against Japan by early August that year. At this point, the Americans were pretty happy to leave Korea to the Soviets. See, they had figured that the Japanese army in Manchuria and Korea would be a very tough nut to crack, and they were happy to leave the casualties to the Soviets. Sure, the Red Army would then occupy Korea, and yeah, Korea might become a center of communist influence in East Asia, but Washington believed that was a price worth paying to secure Soviet entry into the war against Japan. And anyway, Korea wasn't a strategic priority for the U.S. Two things changed this plan in Washington. One, on August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and on August 9th, another atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This strongly implied that the cost of ending the war against Japan would be far lower in American lives than expected. Second, just a few hours before that second atomic bomb, the Soviets invaded Manchuria and swept through the Japanese defenders. This made Washington rethink things. If the war against Japan could be ended with such a low cost in American lives, and the Soviets were about to take all of Korea essentially for free, surely Washington should stand up to them. Here's what Max Hastings has to say about what comes next. Suddenly, Washington's view of both the desirability and feasibility of denying a substantial part of Korea to the Soviets was transformed. Late on the night of the 10th of August, 1945, barely 24 hours after the dropping of the Nagasaki bomb, the State War-Navy Coordinating Committee reached a hasty, unilateral decision that the United States should participate in the occupation of Korea. The two officers drafting orders for the committee pored over their small-scale wall map of the Far East and observed that the 38th parallel ran broadly across the middle of the country. South of this lay the capital, the best of the agriculture and light industry, and more than half the population. The committee knows that if the Soviets want to, they could overrun the entire peninsula before American troops arrive on the scene. But fortunately for Washington, Stalin does not view controlling the whole of Korea as a critical objective. He's far more concerned with Central and Eastern Europe and the situation in China. Red Army troops occupy Pyongyang on August 24th, take the rest of the north, and stop advancing at the 38th parallel. The Americans take a bit longer to get there. The first American troops land at Incheon on September 8, 1945, the men of John Hodge's 24th Corps. In the days that follow, they disembark and disperse to take up their occupation positions in Seoul and across the rest of the South. Feel free to call this an invasion, too. Hodge's men are a mix of tired Pacific War veterans and green replacements fresh from training. As you shall see in the next special that continues this tale, the Americans are unhappy, uninformed, and unprepared for occupation duty. The whole scene is a recipe for trouble and chaos. We'll see what happens soon. To get ever more content like this, special episodes on top of the regular weekly ones, join the TimeGhost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. That will do the trick. And if you want to see an excellent episode about what was going on in China in the 1930s, click here for a Between Two Wars episode we did a few years ago about just that. See you next time.